You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. I generally use this short introduction to say a few words about what I'm going to speak about in the other portions of the program. However, this time I wanted to talk about something which is quite important and has become visible in the last few days. We are now 10 days into what's called the Operation Guardian of the Walls in order to prevent ourselves from being overrun by barrages of missiles from the Gaza Strip. And the American president so far has shown support, but he's coming under pressure from the radical progressive wing of his party. That's the Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar wing. They're telling him to come down on Jerusalem. He's coming under pressure from mainstream Democrats, some of whom sent a letter to Biden on Sunday asking him to take a more active role and work for an immediate ceasefire. Biden has articulated consistent support for Israel's right to defend itself against a barrage of missiles coming from a terrorist organization bent on destroying Israel. And unfortunately, it turns out now, in his position supportive of Israel, he is swimming against a rising tide of anti-Israel sentiment among progressives. He is obviously not deaf to the calls from the progressive in his party. Israel may have to pay a price for this support down the line somewhere, and it may come in the guise of toning down U.S. opposition to Israeli opposition to U.S. re-engagement with Iran over the nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan. That's one thing. The other is there's a large package, a defense deal of support for Israel that progressive members of the Democratic Party have insisted that the president hold up at the moment. That is not good news for the state of Israel. So although Biden has shown support for Israel in the past, he's under pressure from the radical elements, the progressive elements in his own party, and that's something we have to keep our eye upon. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Israel is right now in the middle of a war. And first thing I want to do on the program this week is to share with the listeners some information about a front in that war that we don't hear much about. It doesn't get the big headlines. And I'm talking about the naval front. Israel has several gas installations in the Mediterranean about 25 kilometers off the coast of southern Israel. About 20 or 25 years ago, I was taken out there. I visited the installation. It's very impressive. Now, what's happened is Hamas fired rockets toward Israel's gas installations after launching attacks from Gaza, causing them to be placed on the lowest level of functioning. But none of the rockets came close to reaching the installations. Back in 2019, when there was another violent confrontation, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched 690 rockets and mortars at Israel under 48 hours. That was absolutely nothing compared to what's going on now. Now, during the past week of rocket attacks, Hamas has targeted the country's gas installations, which are prime strategic assets. they've been shooting both rockets and drones at these installations. The rockets were not intercepted, but they never got close to the platforms. But an Israeli Air Force F-16 downed a drone. According to a senior military official, the chances of a rocket actually hit an installation would be about 1 in 10,000. Nevertheless, if one did, Hamas would view it as a major achievement and Israel would have to respond accordingly. Now, interestingly enough, last Monday, the beginning of this week, the IAF, Israel Air Force, targeted a car near the beach in the northern sector of the Gaza Strip, and inside this car were operatives as well as an autonomous submersible naval vessel belonging to Hamas. In other words, Hamas, our enemy, the terrorists, now even have a submarine. So the spokesman for the Israel Army said they recognized immediately preparations for a maritime attack. And apparently the vessel had been brought down to the beach, was being prepared to carry out a terror attack in Israeli waters. But thank heaven it was struck and totally destroyed. Several operatives who had been in the car were killed. Now, apart from the threat to the offshore gas installations, you have to keep in mind that more than 90% of Israeli imports arrive via the Mediterranean. Protecting these sea lanes is not easy. While the country's navy is relatively small compared to other parts of the Israeli military, it has a significant amount of territory to protect from the Islamic growing naval capability. Since Operation Protective Edge back in 2014, both Hamas and other terrorist organizations have significantly expanded naval units, which now include naval commandos, jet skis, autonomous submarines, explosive commando ships, and precision drones. These things are now in the hands of the terrorists. So when one reads about terrorism against Israel, you read about rock throwing, and now you start hearing about rockets fired into Israeli cities, all of which are, of course, terrible things. But it turned out that the terrorists have gained a certain amount of naval capability. So because of this, in this latest round of fighting in the last 2 weeks, the Israeli Navy has carried out dozens of attacks upon targets belonging to the terrorists, including the targeted killings of 3 senior Hamas frogmen. Israel has destroyed 8 warehouses containing naval weaponry, 10 Hamas naval posts, 22 vessels, and other things which they didn't want to report in detail. So obviously the most significant thing, as in any branch of the Israeli Defense Forces, they had to reduce the capabilities of the enemy to maintain a defense posture. So they have attacked outposts, ships, weapons, infrastructure, and operatives. So the whole idea is to ensure that the naval units of the terrorists have been under pressure. That was the information I picked up in news reports, but I admitted that I had no idea how the naval capability of the terrorists is growing. I mean, including even submarines. So I wanted to share this information with the listeners because I think it's important to know how sophisticated the terrorists have become. Another article of information along the same lines, Israel has a branch of the Army called the Surface-to-Surface Rockets and Mortars Department. And this is the team that builds a bank of information so that can be used by the Army. It involves the Israel Air Force, the military intelligence, and the artillery corps working together. About a week after the fighting began, they still have a big list that they still are ready to attack. After 7 days of fighting and hundreds of targets destroyed, there are enough targets to keep striking at the same level as they have done so far. So our army continues to refresh its bank of targets and are ready for a deterioration in the security situation in Gaza. The targets hit by Israel range from rocket launchers, homes of key commanders, banks, drones, research and development facilities for rocket production and rocket manufacturing, as well as top commanders themselves, and something called the Metro, which is an underground tunnel system. And one of the issues and one of the problems is that these tunnels were built under residential buildings. And the idea, according to the Israeli spokesman, is to turn these tunnels essentially into graves of the people who are in these tunnels. These are all terrorists. These tunnels are built under normal-looking homes and apartment buildings, and Israel tries to destroy these things without hurting any or killing as civilians. Civilians was something which cannot be avoided. There's no two ways about it. Israel gives warnings ahead of time, telling people in a particular building, you've got an hour or so to get out because we are coming to get you. And so far, nevertheless, 177 people were killed in Gaza, and 47 of them are children and 29 are women. And this is because primarily they did not respond to the Israeli warning to get away. Israel tries to avoid harming civilians for two reasons. First of all, it's not in our nature. We don't want to harm civilians. We don't want to harm innocents. Secondly, we know how bad it will look on the world scene if civilians are killed. And Hamas knows this. As a consequence, they keep building their tunnels and other terrorist tools, if you will, in places where there are civilians, because they don't really care about the death of their own people, but they know it shows up well against Israel when civilians are killed. So not only do we in Israel have to protect ourselves from these terrorists who are becoming more and more sophisticated, but we have to protect ourselves against the propaganda efforts of these terrorists to make us look bad on the world scene. And that affects the way Israel acts and how it chooses its targets. You know, it's interesting. During the Second World War, for example, the Allies bombed German cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians under the claim, which was true, that these areas contained military objectives. But they didn't warn. You don't warn people to get out of the way. It's up to those people to protect themselves. But now we have a situation where the enemy, the terrorists, particularly put people in these areas where they have their military facilities, knowing that Israel will attack and civilians will be killed, and that simply doesn't look good for Israel. These are the facts of life. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
We're back with Jay Shapiro. Israel is in the middle of a war. People around the world realize this. We get headlines everywhere. But this is the first time, I believe, since 1948 that the war is not just on our borders, but it's also taking place within our cities. Israel is battling its way through one of the most intensive conflicts the country has experienced in recent years. But no matter how many terrorists or facilities are hit in Gaza, it seems that Hamas is getting the upper hand in terms of the way it looks. It managed to shift the battlefield from the areas within rocket range, and the battlefield is now the entire country because riots are shaking at all corners of Israel. This round of fighting seems to have its base, to begin with, about 3 weeks ago in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, Hamas stressed that it fired a barrage of rockets towards Jerusalem due to planned evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and Israeli measures surrounding the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, briefly, what happened is Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, it was a Jewish neighborhood. The Jews were kicked out in 1948. In 1967, the area fell under Israel, and recently, within the last several years, Jews have started moving back into the neighborhood, and they have claimed that many of the properties in which Arabs live are actually owned by Jews, and have been able to prove this with legal documentation, and the government, the courts, have indicated that the Jews are right, that the property belongs to them or to their families, and they are now going to evict the Arabs who took over this place illegally back in 1948. Now, this has become a source of tremendous propaganda and rioting against Israel. Now, Hamas claims to be defending Jerusalem against what it claims are aggressive Israeli measures and what they call Judaization efforts. Now, what happened this time, Hamas has succeeded in uniting forces within the West Bank and among Arab-Israeli communities. Outrage at perceived Jewish assault on Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, as well as protests against Israeli action in Gaza, have blown up, and riots have occurred in Jerusalem, in Haifa, and several other cities, including Lod, which is right near the airport, and Jews had to move out because of rioting, and Arabs, presumably many of them being their neighbors, came in and looted and destroyed their homes. Now, the violence quickly spread to other cities. Arab residents have assaulted Jews on the streets and in their homes. They burned synagogues, and they vandalized large areas. Now, it is true, we have to be honest, some very small groups of Jewish extremists have attacked Arabs, but this is really peripheral. No Jew promotes Jews to attack Arabs, while the Arab leadership is provoking its own people and stirring them up against their Jewish neighbors. Now, these images have brought back images of the terrible riots 100 years ago, 1929, when the British still had the mandate, when Arabs across the entire area committed pogroms against their Jewish neighbors. Now, those things were, again, they sparked by incitement from Muslim leaders who used Al-Aqsa as their political playing card and quickly escalated due to misinformation and excitement. And Jews and Arabs also clashed during the unrest in 1929. This has happened before. We thought these days were gone forever. During the last 2 weeks, Jews and Arabs across Israel, but primarily in the mixed cities, have gone out to the streets prepared for violence. The the Jewish groups we know are extremists and they are really looked down upon. But these Jewish groups portrayed themselves as protecting Jewish civilians, but are simply in many cases hooligans looking to take out their anger on random Arabs. And it's unfortunate. In Jerusalem and the West Bank, rioters have clashed with security forces on a nightly basis for the last 2 weeks. Along the borders with Lebanon and Jordan, protesters attempted to break through the border fence. In Lebanon, what seemed to be a Palestinian terror group even launched 3 rockets toward Israel. This is something that not happened in years. Hamas has achieved what it has called for in statement after statement and year after year. They've called for unity through hatred. And it has united communities from Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank, and even in Israeli cities in rage against the state of Israel. In the meantime, Israel stands divided, torn by political strife, instability, and infighting among the politicians. By the way, one of the things that really struck me, I don't want to say it struck terror, but it really shocked me. There was a picture of an Arab, an Israeli citizen, in the town of Lud. He climbed up a pole in the middle of the street, tore down an Israeli flag, the flag of a country in which he is a citizen, and put up the flag of one of the terrorist groups. And that is really a bad sign. Now, many government officials responded to the situation by calling for stronger force by Israeli security forces. Israel has not had a stable government for 2 years. And now we have this whole new situation. Maybe it's not really a new situation. It's one that's gone undercover since 1948. There are people who are trying to lower the flames. Joint Jewish-Arab demonstrations have called for coexistence and peace. Municipal officials from all sectors released joint statements calling for residents to calm the situation, avoid violence. But when you see people interviewed on television, Jews from the city of Lud, for example, who say that they were so frightened of what their neighbors could do that they left town for a few days, came back and found that their homes had essentially been robbed and destroyed by their neighbors. So these are very serious problems. Despite the best efforts of activists, city officials, and security forces, violence is still ravaging the streets of Israel. Enraged Arabs and Jews are clashing using the word civil war and using the word pogrom. They're throwing around these words by civilians living with the uncertainty of an unprecedented situation when you suddenly really cannot trust your neighbors. Now, the army, the military, is registering great achievements in what they're doing against the terrorists. But meanwhile, the home, the house, appears to be collapsing from within. Israel is winning battles on the borders, but it could well be that Hamas has the upper hand in the internal struggle. In just a week, Hamas succeeded in igniting a civil conflict between Jews and Arabs within Israeli territory and sparking one of the largest conflicts in recent years since the founding of the state. Now, obviously, our defense force will eventually finish up in Gaza, as it always does, and the violence in the streets will eventually die down. But the question is, what will be the state of the country? How does Israel move on? 20% of the Israeli population is Arabs. Obviously, most of them just want to go about their business. The question is, what will their leadership do? So Israel has gone over 2 years without a stable government, and incitement has plagued Israel for a long time. It's only intensified during this corona crisis and now with this war. And Israeli society is split, and hostile rhetoric from all sides plagues the media and politics. Officials attempting to garner favor during all these rounds of elections. It is a very unhealthy situation. Hamas saw the situation and used it to its advantage, taking the anger and hurt already simmering across Israeli society, put her on a high flame. It is a very difficult situation, the worst since I've come to this country. On this note, I'll stop this section of the program. I'll be right back.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. On the previous sections of this program, I was describing the situation now in Israel, where essentially there is a conflict between the state of Israel and Hamas. The Palestinian Authority does not get involved in this for some reason or other. You don't hear much about them. So it's primarily Hamas against Israel. And the source of the problem right now is supposedly something that happened in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem and something that happened on the Temple Mount. This is what is considered to be the cause of all the problems right now. I came across an article by someone called Neville Teller. I never heard of him before. He's a writer who's a Middle East correspondent for Eurasia Review. And he has a different theory, altogether different, and I want to share that with the listeners. It's something I had never seen before, and maybe there is validity to it. He claims that the conflict now, the cause of the conflict now being the problem between what happened in Sheikh Jarrah and what happened on the Temple Mount, according to Neville Teller, it's really a phony. Because there is a different reason for this. What's happening is that over the last year, perhaps since about a year ago, an alliance has come about between Israel and a number of Muslim countries, and this is very disturbing to other Muslim countries such as Iran, Turkey, and it's very disturbing to Hamas and Hezbollah. So these countries, Iran, Turkey, and Hamas and Hezbollah, which are two terrorist groups, they are in violent opposition to the Abraham Accords between Israel and the other Muslim nations. And this is the reason for what they're doing now. When the agreements were announced, Turkey's president expressed outrage and threatened to cut diplomatic ties with the Emirates. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei denounced the accords as a humiliation for us Muslim nations. Now, since then, the Islamic Axis has calculated that the best way to shatter is Israel's newly forged relations with Gulf states and Morocco. The best way to shatter this would be to renew the Hamas-Israel conflict, making sure the precipitating cause was connected to sensitive Muslim interests. In other words, the goal of Hamas and these other countries is to destroy Israel's new relations with Muslim countries, and the way to do it was to find some real cause that other Muslim nations have to defend and oppose Israel. And the cause is primarily the business with the Temple Mount, because these are sensitive Muslim interests. And an equally important precipitating factor in the current conflict is the determined effort by leaders of Hamas and is to seize control of the Palestinian cause, to take over and kick out the Palestinian Authority, to become the undisputed champions of Palestinianism. This they regard as a vital step toward their ultimate aim, which is the destruction of Israel. So all the evidence so far suggests that the barrage of rockets fired against Israel is part of a long-standing campaign to wrest the leadership of the Palestinian people from Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority. So all that the Palestinian terrorists, together with their Islamic backers, have been waiting for was an excuse, or a series of excuses, to provoke a fresh confrontation, fomenting provocation on the Temple Mount, and indignation over the Sheikh Jarrah affair provided the convenient smokescreen. So everything that's happening now is really an attempt by Hamas to take over from the Palestinian Authority. So as part of their campaign to wreck the accords between Israel and these other Muslim nations, Turkey and Iran, as well as Islamic supporting governments like Qatar, are keen that Hamas, committed to the destruction of Israel, becomes the dominant voice in the Palestinian politics in place of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. So these leaders of Turkey, for example, and Iran, have been hoping that Hamas would emerge victorious in the Palestinian elections, which were due to be held on May 22nd, but now they've been put off under intense pressure from the United States. So, in order to restore some degree of the democratic credibility to the Palestinian Authority, the polling will now take place maybe in late May or early July. Now, however, these people are only too well aware that the outcome of free and fair elections under neutral observation would probably result in an even greater Hamas victory than occurred back in 2006. That probably would not have escaped Israeli attention either. When the question arose of arrangements for eligible Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem to vote in the Palestinian elections, Israel didn't say yes and they didn't say no. And Abbas seized on the issue and canceled the elections. Meanwhile, the Hamas leader, grasping the opportunity to parade himself as the Palestinian people's defender, urged Abbas to defy Israel and go ahead with the polls. Hamas further strengthened its position on the Temple Mount issue, demanding that Israel remove the police there by a given deadline. And then Hamas launched rockets against Jerusalem when its ultimatum went unheeded. So a barrage of missiles subsequently rained down on Israel, and it was intended to consolidate the status of Hamas as the Palestinians' champion as opposed to the Palestinian Authority. So the conflict is as much a battle for control of the Palestinian cause as it is an opportunity to attack Israel. For months, Israel's security officials have warned that Hamas has been building stockpiles of missiles in Gaza in anticipation of renewed hostilities. The most sophisticated, manufactured locally, are based on medium range Iranian systems, enabling Hamas to strike targets in major Israeli population centers as far as Eilat. So, this last upsurge in Palestinian violence is due in no small measure to the obscure messages emanating from Washington about the U.S. administration's stance on the Middle East. President Joe Biden certainly wants an end to the conflict, but he has been anything but clear about where he stands on the achievement of his predecessor, Donald Trump, in fostering Arab Israel peace. In other words, Trump did a great job. Nobody expected that, to really foster peace between Israel and Arab countries, and now they don't know how to handle it. So Biden has so far shown a little interest in maintaining the momentum of these agreements of the Abraham Accords. On the contrary, he's shown considerable enthusiasm for reopening dialogue with Iran and reviving the controversial nuclear deal. The Abraham Accords are founded in part on a common Arab-Israeli desire to counter Iranian attempts to dominate the Middle East. So Biden's position now gives comfort to Israel's enemies. Middle East players interested in peace rather than eternal conflict need a display of strong U.S. leadership, which it is not getting. So all these factors have come together to provide the fuel for the conflagration that's going on now. On one hand, there's a desire to attack Israel in a pursuit of a long-term aim of overthrowing the Jewish state, but by itself, it's insufficient to spark conflict. What happened is now that Hamas is using this conflict to strengthen itself. They want to seize control of the Palestinian cause from the Palestinian Authority. That's behind all this. Meantime, they're getting ambiguous signals from the Biden administration, which is trying to reopen the nuclear deal with Iran. So this gentleman, Neville Taylor, which I had never heard of him before, quite honestly, has essentially defined a wholly different reason for what's happening now. It's Hamas's desire to take over the Palestinian cause and to get rid of the Palestinian Authority. That is what we are witnessing. So I don't know how accurate this analysis is, but it certainly is novel, and I've explained it here as best as I can to the listeners to give it some thought. I never thought about it before, but it seems to be something on the table that we got to think about. Never a dull moment in the Middle East. I'll be back next time. Thanks for listening.